They raped me repeatedly.
Actually, there was order to finish the railway early, so they had to compel the sick man to work hard.
Some of the most heinous and grotesque atrocities of World War II were surprisingly not the Nazi concentration camps. In fact, the Japanese would make games and contests around the way they tortured people. Very popular contest in Japan. What contest? Who decapitates the most enemies? Torture, biological weapons testing, and the systematic rape of tens of thousands of women doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of these unspeakable acts. Today we explore some of the most depraved acts human beings have ever committed in history, as we reveal the most unimaginable atrocities conducted by the Japanese army during World War II. Number 13. Nanjing Massacre. After recording a bloody victory in Shanghai during the early days of the Second World War, the Imperial Army of Japan set its sights on conquering new territories within China, particularly the nation's capital city of Nanjing. Out of fear of losing his valuable military forces in the inevitable battle, Chiang Kai-shek, China's nationalist leader, ordered the removal of all the Chinese troops from the city, leaving the people with only a handful of untrained auxiliary troops. In addition, Chiang also gave strict orders for the city to be held at any cost, while forbidding the official evacuation of the citizens. This turned out to be a recipe for disaster. Those brave enough to escape by their own efforts saved their families from the horrors the Japanese were about to unleash. But for those stuck within the walls of the city, the next 6 weeks were an enactment of hell. On December 1st, 1937, the Chinese government officially abandoned Nanjing, leaving the International Committee in charge. A few days later, on December 13, the first troops of Japan's Central China Front Army, under the command of General Matsui, Iwani invaded the city. The troops, hungry, undisciplined, and seeking revenge for their fellow soldiers lost in battle, descended upon the city with unfettered savagery. Families were massacred, public executions became commonplace, targeting even the elderly and infants. Streets were flooded with bodies, whole and mutilated, and thousands of women were assaulted in the most brutal way possible. 1/3 of the city was also burned to the ground by the Japanese forces, who were determined not only to pillage the city, but also completely burn it to the ground. Historical accounts record that between 20,000 to 80,000 women were tortured and assaulted, and then mutilated and killed afterwards. It was one of the most barbaric displays ever recorded in the war, and the stains remain forever etched on the city till today. Although there are no official numbers on the death toll of the Nanjing Massacre, experts estimate that between 200 to 300,000 people lost their lives before the horrors finally subsided in February 1938. Number 12. Vivisection without anesthesia. As the Second World War raged on, Japan intensified its efforts in the development of weapons and the study of new medical procedures, using the captured civilians and soldiers as lab rats. Of all the despicable evils perpetrated by the nation during the war, this might just be the most disturbing. Thousands of men, women, children, and even infants locked away in the war camps became victims of these inhumane experiments as Japanese scientists subjected them to vivisections without anesthesia, most of which ended in death. These disturbing experiments were conducted within a facility known as Unit 731, a covert military facility whose secrets eventually exposed the underreported war crimes of Japan during the dark days of the Second World War. In a video interview which shocked the public, Okawa Fukumatsu, a former member of Unit 731, admitted to vivisecting a pregnant woman as part of a deranged study meant to determine the effect of certain conditions and diseases on the fetus. Researchers also had the liberty of performing invasive surgery on prisoners, removing their internal organs for study, and amputating their limbs in order to study blood loss. With the restrictions of ethics and morality thrown out the window, Japanese scientists explored the freedom of experimenting on humans, sometimes surgically removing their esophagus and then reattaching them to the intestines. Organs such as the brain, liver, and lungs were also removed from the subjects, while they writhed in pain before the light eventually left their eyes. According to Japanese Army surgeon Ken Yuasa, the practice also extended beyond Unit 731, involving at least 1,000 Japanese scientists who conducted varying studies throughout mainland China using the civilians caught in the crossfire. For most war prisoners, being led into the lab was a death sentence, and most of them showed no signs of struggle when they were led into the facility, but for the surgeons, it was all routine. As soon as the scientists were done with the body, they would typically be shot or executed by lethal injection before their bodies are then buried in mass graves. However, there are also cases where prisoners were buried alive after experiments, adding a new layer of horror to the whole story. Number 11. Comfort Women System. As the echoes of bombs and guns enveloped the Pacific Theater during the Second World War, women became the major scapegoat of the unfettered violence. They were subjected to forced intimacy and kidnappings and coerced into satisfying the pleasures of the soldiers. Between 1932 and 1945, Japan controlled the largest case of government-sponsored human trafficking and sexual slavery in human history, subjecting hundreds of thousands of women to prostitution. These victims, known as comfort women, emerged from varying backgrounds ranging from Australia to Burma, China, Korea, Indonesia, New Guinea, the Netherlands, and other countries. According to recorded history, the brothels housing these comfort women were established to provide the fighting warriors with a sexual outlet in a bid to reduce wartime forceful intimacy and the spread of STDs. However, it ended up achieving the opposite effect, as the spread of venereal diseases increased significantly and cases of forced intercourse went through the roof. At first, the Comfort Women program recruited Japanese women, some by conventional means, and others through deception and kidnapping. Many of the women were lured with the promise of regular jobs like nurses and factory workers, but ended up getting used for the men's pleasure. As news of the maltreatment many of the comfort women suffered became widespread, Japanese women stopped signing up, forcing the government to begin the abduction of their prisoners of war and forcing them into the program. This ended very badly because, according to the Confucian culture, a woman's virginity is valued above her own life, and premarital sex is considered the highest form of shame. Because of this, many of the women who survived the horrors of the Comfort Women program ended up taking their own lives, while the others never spoke about it until their deaths. Years after the war passed, Japan refused to acknowledge the existence of the program in a bid to restore their reputation, before finally tendering an official apology in the 1990s. Number 10. Biological pathogen testing. In a bid to gain the superior advantage during the war, Japan established a program to diversify its warfare tactics from just guns and bombs, and instead tried to fight the enemies with their own bodies. This was the goal that gave birth to the Pathogen and Biological Weapons Program, aimed at spreading deadly diseases among the Chinese populace, both military and civilian. But it wasn't just these weapons that chilled the public to the bones, but the plan to test them on innocent war prisoners. This was where Unit 731 and its other affiliates, Unit 1644 and Unit 100, came into the picture. Scientists working in these facilities were tasked with researching, developing, and experimenting the possibility of causing an epidemic within enemy territories, an endeavor that crossed every single line of morality and war ethics. By 1939, the program had made significant progress with the introduction of 6 potent pathogens: anthrax, typhoid, paratyphoid, glanders, dysentery, and human fleas infected with plagues all became weapons in the hands of the Japanese government. To determine the effects of these diseases on the enemy forces, the Japanese military subjected their prisoners of war to inhumane testings, exposing them to their deadly diseases and studying the results. With these experiments, they were able to determine accurate doses that would produce desired results, as well as how best to maximize their potential on the battlefield. What followed was the release of biodegradable bombs housing live rats and fleas into Chinese territories. Additionally, the program also used contaminated birds and bird feathers to spread anthrax and other deadly diseases, releasing them from low-flying airplanes over Chinese cities, including Ningbo, Chengde, and Hunan province between 1940 and 1941. As the bubonic plague spread within these territories, tens of thousands lost their lives, not to deadly weapons, but to diseases intentionally spread by their warring neighbors. Number 9. Frostbite Experiments. Among the many extreme scientists who conducted inhumane research at Unit 731 was Army engineer Hisato Yoshimura, a medical scientist, physiologist, and war criminal. His methods, however, were noticeably different from the rest. Rather than subject them to forced surgeries and studying their internal organs, Yoshimura would take these captives outside and dip their appendages into water of varying temperatures so their limbs could freeze. Once frozen, he would then strike the affected limbs with a short stick, which, according to reports, would emit a sound resembling that which a board gives when it is struck. The ice would then be chipped away from these living subjects, with the affected limbs being subjected to various treatments to restore them to normal conditions. Like scenes from a horror movie, hundreds of captives were lined up and forced to partake in these bizarre experiments, most of which led to their eventual death, earning Yoshimura the nickname Scientific Devil. According to historical records, Yoshimura once soaked the fingers of a 3-day-old baby in water containing ice and salt, so he could study the freezing effects on infants in contrast to adults. Another member of Unit 731, identified as Naoji Wazono, described a grisly scene during a 1980s interview, recounting how Yoshimura forced 2 naked men into an area with temperatures of -40 to 50 degrees, while researchers filmed the process until the subjects died. The scene was said to have been so horrific that the 2 men were digging their nails into each other's flesh, as Yoshimura watched on for sick pleasure. Through these series of tests and experiments, Yoshimura developed a resistance index of frostbite, although he's more known as a war criminal now than a renowned scientist. Number 8. Baton Death March. On April 9, 1942, the infamous Battle of Baton ended after United States General Edward P. King surrendered to General Masaharu Homa of the Japanese Imperial Army. Immediately following the defeat, 75,000 soldiers became prisoners of war in that very moment, including 12,000 Americans and 63,000 Filipinos. What followed was the Baton Death March, one of the most horrifying atrocities of modern warfare. For the Japanese forces, the first order of business was rounding up the American and Filipino soldiers and splitting them into groups of approximately 100 on the only paved road that ran down the Baton Peninsula. 4 guards were assigned to each group as they began the march toward Camp O'Donnell in Tarlac Province, located 65 miles away. Hungry and having lost 30% of their body mass before their surrender, the men were forced to walk through the blistering heat. Any soldier who was unlucky enough to fall during the march, or attempting to escape, or even stopping to quench his thirst at a roadside puddle, was either shot or bayoneted. Their bodies were left on the roadside as the others marched on to their doom. The men were given just enough water and food to keep them alive during the 65 miles, and any Filipino civilian attempting to offer them food or water was either chased off, bayoneted, or shot as well. At several points along the route, the Japanese soldiers would single out a couple of prisoners, tie them to trees or fences, and shoot them to death to keep everyone in check. It is estimated that between 7,000 to 10,000 men were killed during this death match, but since there are no official records, the true figures may never be known. Number 7. Chemical weapons testing. As several nations embroiled in the Second World War battled to turn the tides of war, scientists and researchers also worked round the clock to build deadly chemical weapons capable of causing total devastation to the enemies. Unit 7-3. Japan's most unhinged unit, was charged with the development of these chemical agents, many of which were later tested on war prisoners to determine their lethality. To support the war effort, Japan developed chemical weapons like mustard gas, lewisite, cyanic acid gas, white phosphorus, atomsite, and phosgene gas. There are countless testimonies from eyewitnesses detailing the horrors of watching these prisoners suffer from the effect of the chemical weapons. One former Army major and technician, who opted for anonymity, recalled attending a poison gas test at the Unit 731 facilities in 1943 and watching a Chinese man fight for his life after being subjected to atomsite, a sneezing gas. He claimed that for 10 minutes, the man went into violent coughing convulsions and suffered excruciating pains before he eventually left because he couldn't bear to watch anymore. Takeo Wano, a former medical worker in Unit 731, also had an even more horrifying story. He claimed to have seen a Russian man being cut into 2 pieces and pickled in a jar of formaldehyde. Reports also indicate that Japanese scientists used portable gas chambers to carry out experiments on the go, while there are also records of the use of chemical weapons on prisoners in field conditions. One of such cases was said to have taken place between the 7th to 10th of September, 1940, involving 20 subjects. These prisoners were divided into 3 groups and placed in combat emplacements, trenches, gazebos, and observatories, before they were then subjected to varying amounts of mustard gas. The scientists then monitored the damage to their skin, eye, respiratory organs, and digestive organs within intervals of 4 hours, 24 hours, and 2 to 5 days after exposure. While other nations never recorded the use of chemical agents, Japan remains the only nation that unleashed terror on its Chinese neighbors with these devastating weapons. Number 6, Rape of Manila. As the curtains began closing on World War II and Japanese forces edged closer to their imminent defeat, they decided to commit one last act of depravity. While the United States Army advanced into the city of Manila between February and March 1945, the Japanese troops stationed in the city took their anger and frustration out on the civilians in the city. For several days, there was an outbreak of violence as the armed men moved about to mutilate, assault, and massacre anyone in sight, including women and children. Students in schools were not spared, and several hospitals, including the San Juan de Dios Hospital and the Santa Rosa College, were attacked. And even convents like Santo Domingo Church, Manila Cathedral, Paco Church, St. Paul's Convent, and St. Vincent de Paul Church were also targeted by the attackers. In their final act of defense, the Japanese fleets lined up the Filipino women and children as human shields on the front lines, and any one of them who survived was then executed by the Japanese. As their defense crumbled like a pack of cards, the Japanese began a mop-up operation to clear guerrillas of North Manila. This led to the execution of over 54,000 Filipinos, including children, who were mowed down as the soldiers passed through the towns. While the civilians were also trying to flee, pregnant Filipino women were caught, killed, and their bellies were ripped open by the Japanese soldiers. The Bayview Hotel, located within the city, was designated for committing unimaginable atrocities against women. In total, about 400 women and girls, some of whom were just 12 years old, were taken to the hotel, where the enlisted Japanese soldiers took turns defiling them. The soldiers would then murder them and set their remains on fire. In total, 100,000 civilians were killed during the Battle of Manila. However, some estimate that the real figures may actually be around 500,000. Number 5, cannibalism. Not only were the Japanese forces defiling and mutilating civilians during the Second World War, but they also took the brutality to a whole new level, butchering and feeding on the bodies of both fallen soldiers and civilians. As the war raged on in the Pacific Theater, occupying Japanese officers and soldiers faced extreme food shortages, and as Allied forces pushed them further and further, with every attack, their resources became more and more depleted. While some soldiers survived by stealing food from farmers around their bases and murdering them in the process, others weren't deployed in agricultural areas, which meant they had to resort to other means. Out of desperation, some Japanese commanders ordered their men to kill and eat the enemy forces and even the locals. However, there were also cases where such extreme measures were deemed unnecessary, like with the story of the 8 American pilots whose plane was shot down but managed to bail out after a raid on Chichijima. As the airmen swam ashore, they fell into the hands of the Japanese soldiers, who murdered some of them on the spot and saved the rest for dinner. In other instances, the captured soldiers were eaten slowly one by one, while there were also reports of limbs being chopped off while the victims were still alive. In such instances, cannibalism wasn't a result of desperation, but as a tool to project power and control. While the Japanese government has worked tirelessly to erase this portion of its history, confirmed stories have shown that these horrors were a vital part of Japan's strategy throughout the Second World War. Number 4, the Death Railway. Following the defeat of the Japanese soldiers in the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, and the Battle of Midway on June 6, The sea lane between the Japanese home islands and Burma were deemed unsafe, which meant that reinforcements and supplies could not get to the forces as quickly as needed. To combat this problem, the Japanese military sought an overland route to transport both supplies and troops. To build this new route, the Japanese government pushed 200,000 Asians into forced conscription, in addition to the 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, who were now considered slaves by the government. This was how the construction of the Burma Railway began. Among these prisoners of war, there were 30,000 British soldiers, 13,000 Australians, 18,000 Dutch, and 700 Americans. Work began in June 1942, and between then and October 1943, the prisoners of war and forced laborers worked every single day to lay 358 miles of railway tracks from Baton, Thailand to Thambouzayat. However, many of those who started the project lost their lives before it ended. Some died of deadly diseases, others malnutrition, and some were tortured and killed by the Japanese themselves. Because of the urgency of the project, the prisoners were pushed to their limits to speed up the construction. It was an extremely difficult project, which took the prisoners through thick jungles infested with mosquitoes and uneven terrains, all while they battled a monsoon. During the construction, they also had to build bridges over rivers and canyons, as well as cutting away sections of mountains to create a bed straight and level enough to accommodate the narrow-gauge tracks. A section of the Death Railway, known as the Hellfire Pass, subjected the workers to the harshest and most extreme conditions, which was where the most people died. Cutting out sections of mountains was also done using inadequate hand tools, and at some points when the work was running behind schedule, prisoners were forced to work for 18 hours. Whenever the Japanese were dissatisfied with the conditions of their work, the prisoners were subjected to severe physical punishment, some of which eventually led to the death of about 700 Allied prisoners. For those who stayed alive, survival was a daily battle, as they had to endure malnutrition. For their daily meal, the prisoners were fed small portions of boiled rice and spoiled meat or fish, which would often be contaminated with rat droppings and infested with maggots. There was also a severe lack of water, which meant that they were often dehydrated and predisposed to illness. These conditions, combined with the unsanitary conditions in the work camp and tropical environment, exposed them to illnesses like dysentery and diarrhea, which caused 1/3 of all the deaths. In addition, there were also cases of cholera outbreaks, malaria, tropical ulcers, and many more. For many of the sick, treatment was unsatisfactory, and sometimes they were even left to die, while the rest of the workers were forced to keep working. Today, the horrors of the Burma Railway remain etched in the hearts and minds of nations around the world, with many memorial sites erected on the route, dedicated to those who lost their lives during the construction. Number 3. The Suk Ching Massacre. 1942. A year which remains etched in the hearts and minds of the citizens and families of those who lost their lives in the infamous Suk Ching Massacre. Between February 18th and the 4th of March, 1942, the Japanese soldiers conducted a systematic purge of anyone deemed anti-Japanese, racking up the death toll to over 250,000. Prior to this horrific massacre, Singapore was considered a highly strategic point during the war, which motivated the Japanese forces to unleash mayhem in an attempt to take control of the city. From February 8th to 15th, the Japanese military launched a massive attack on the city, eventually overpowering the combined British and Commonwealth forces. By the time the smoke cleared, the Allies suffered such a stunning defeat that they were forced to surrender, becoming Britain's largest surrender in recorded history. This was the beginning of untold horrors for the citizens. Just 3 days later, Japanese forces began the mass killing of people declared undesirables, which mostly included Chinese citizens. On one hand, this was seen as a show of force in response to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which had been ongoing since 1937. On the other hand, this was considered a hate crime against China, Japan's arch-rival at the time. The deadly operation was overseen by Japan's secret police, known as the Kempeitai. But their horrific crimes didn't end within the walls of Singapore. Instead, the soldiers also attacked the Chinese population in Malaya, which was under Japanese occupation at the time, killing anyone who fit the profile. Even non-Chinese individuals were not spared in this widespread massacre. Elsewhere, over 150,000 Tamil Indians were killed, in addition to 90,000 civilians across Burma and Thailand. This move was mostly considered an act of intimidation against the Chinese community and revenge for the anti-Japanese activity in the Sinophone regions. Although Japanese authorities acknowledged the massacre following the conclusion of the Second World War, official reports claim that no more than 6,000 people were killed, a gross underreporting, and to the Chinese people, insult to injury. Number 2, Pearl Harbor attack. It was around 7:48 a.m. on 7th December 1941 when the first bomb dropped. But more was to come, and the United States was not prepared. On this day, 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft, including fighter jets, level and dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, launched a surprise massive attack on the United States in one of the deadliest invasions in the nation's history. All 8 United States Navy battleships present at the military base were damaged. 4 ended up at the bottom of the ocean. All except for the USS Arizona were later brought back to the surface, and 6 went on to fight in the war. The Japanese attack also sank 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 1 anti-aircraft training ship, and 1 mine layer. In addition, 108 U.S. aircraft were also destroyed. As for the casualties, 2,393 Americans were killed, with 1,178 sustaining varying degrees of injuries. On the Japanese side, though, the damage was light. Only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines were lost, and 129 servicemen lost their lives. Kazuo Sakamaki, the commanding officer of one of the submarines, was also captured. In the wake of the attack, Japan declared war on the United States and the British Empire later that day, and both nations returned the favor. Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States due to their alliance with Japan, and the United States also responded with its own declaration of war. One major talking point after the attack was the fact that the United States had little to no prior warning. As required by the Hague Convention of 1907, attacks of such magnitude required formal warning, and considering how the attack was unprovoked, it only attracted condemnation from the rest of the world. As President Franklin Roosevelt said in his speech to Congress on December 7, 1941, "It's a date which will live in infamy." Number 1. Rape and pillaging in Korea. Before the first shots of the Second World War were fired, Korea had been subjected to servitude under Japan, but the war only made the bad situation worse. It was in 1910 when Japan first annexed Korea, occupying the peninsula until 1945, after the Axis lost the war. During this period, thousands and even millions of Koreans lived in abject poverty, while also being forced to worship the Japanese like gods. But it wasn't just their freedom that was lost. Their culture was also being systematically wiped out, as many of them were forced to abandon their names for Japanese names. When Japan entered the Second World War in September 1940, Koreans were also obligated to enlist in the Japanese military. But this wasn't the end. Thousands of Korean girls and women were also thrown into sexual slavery, while others were sent to labor in Japanese factories and mines. They were starved, tortured, and killed in droves, and anyone who arose in the fight for freedom was either imprisoned, tortured, or killed as well. As part of the cultural genocide, Japanese forces also removed many ancient cultural artifacts from Korea during the occupation, many of which have still not been returned over 8 decades later. Today, over 75,000 Korean artifacts are lost in Japan, many of which are still on display in Japanese museums and private collections. However, efforts are still underway to reclaim these lost artifacts, as both the South Korean and North Korean governments work to restore their heritage pillaged in the days of World War II. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.